The idea, the concept of sharing is being discussed by many groups out there. Pretty much all progressive movements, causes, mobilizations have the call for sharing implicit, if not explicit. And it's an interlinking issue that for us is the most urgent conversation to be having. And you can, for example, we just have seen COP24, the climate change discussions, this a new pact on the migration crisis, and the need for sharing the world's resources is central to all of these issues. So, particularly in terms of the extreme discrepancies in living standards between rich and poor, between countries, within every country, is the crisis underlying almost every other political crisis. And sharing is directly needed as a solution to all of these crises. If you're talking about global conflict, if you're talking about the ecological crisis, if you're talking about inequality, poverty, sharing is at the center of this. And increasingly, we are seeing this call for sharing being expressed. And what we're about is trying to raise awareness of the need for sharing to be an overarching issue in terms of the political, economic aspects of sharing, and for people to really engage with this conversation and create a movement around the need to share the world's resources with a particular focus on economic and social rights. Article 25 we talk about, which is part of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and proclaims the right of everyone to an adequate standard of living. And for us, that is at the forefront of what's needed in terms of transforming the world. I think the call for sharing is more and more implicit within all the progressive political movements out there. And it is realistic, but what it depends upon is massive civic engagement around these issues, which is what we're lacking. And if people do get enough people, ordinary people, as well as progressive campaigners and activists, get involved with the call, with the necessity of sharing the world's resources as an answer to the civilizational crisis that we're in, then it is a viable solution, because then it would, of course, impel governments to make necessary changes both nationally and globally through the United Nations. Well, from our point of view as a campaigning organization, we are pioneering the need for people to come together on a single overarching issue, which we see as the need to implement Article 25. And of course, all issues, progressive issues today, are urgent and critical for people to be involved in whatever activist cause they're doing. But also at the same time, we're advocating for the need for people to come together and see Article 25 particularly as an overarching single demand, a simple demand that can appeal to everyone and unify global movement, which is what we're really lacking. We first need is for people to become aware of the simple urgency of Article 25. According to UNCTAD of the United Nations, the Trade and Development Agency within the UN, about 60% of the whole global population is living on less than $5 a day, which is considered, from UNCTAD's point of view, the minimal standard of living required to fulfill Article 25, an adequate standard of living. According to the ILO, the International Labour Organization of the UN, less than 30% of people have access to comprehensive social security guarantees, which again is enshrined within Article 25, the right to social security. So the vast majority of the world is lacking their basic economic and social rights. And if there is enough of awareness and engagement around this issue, the results would be potentially transformative of our domestic policies, which are in many ways going in the opposite direction from Article 25, from sharing the world's resources in any respect. So again, it comes back to the need for engagement around this issue, and then to see the potential of mobilizing around this unifying cause. There's a lot of work recently has been in the news around the work of Philip Alston, the UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty, and he's really highlighted the lack of legal accountability that governments have enshrined in terms of Article 25. Of course, Article 25 in 1948, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, they were later, there was the further International Bill of Human Rights was agreed in 1966. There was the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, which was seen as the kind of the implementing treaties for the Universal Declaration, for the economic and social rights of the Universal Declaration. And what the work of Philip Alston shows is how, despite the constitutional recognition of economic and social rights, there is still a widespread lack of legal accountability, and accountability mechanisms. He came to the UK just recently and just highlighted how far the UK is straying from implementing basic economic and social rights through our transformation of the benefit system, through the problems in the National Health Service and so on. He's been to the United States and showed how the USA has perhaps the worst record in terms of its recognition of economic and social rights. So in terms of the government's recognition, the record is poor and has always been very poor since the UN was founded. But then, of course, if you look at the entire architecture of the global economy, itself mitigates the implementation of Article 25. The Bretton Woods institutions, the Group of Seven Nations, the WTO, the main global economic governance institutions that we have mitigate against people's fulfillment of their basic rights. We have a great example is structural adjustment policies, which were pushed by the IMF and the World Bank in the 1980s. There's a rich literature which highlights how governments were pushed to prioritize debt repayments over fulfilling the basic needs of their citizens. And the results have been catastrophic in terms of the creation of poverty, hunger, and the fulfillment of basic rights. So it's a long story, but the point is that if you are to implement Article 25, if there is enough of a groundswell of popular support for these basic rights in our own countries and internationally, then the results would be politically transformative, and it would have a direct implication for the work of the United Nations and the need to empower the UN and its agencies, its frontline agencies, which are doing work to counter the worst effects of the humanitarian crises that we're seeing. I mean, we ourselves, we see that the solution, if we are to get involved with specific government policies, like in the UK, for example, if we're to get involved in the kind of anti-austerity movements and campaigning on specific issues, the benefits issue, universal credit, whatever it might be, our influence would be quite limited. And there are a lot of groups doing really valuable work around that. For us, it's really about trying to inspire ordinary people to get together and create these grassroots massive movements. Because that's how we see change really coming about. And hence our work is focused on awareness, raising and education. I mentioned Philip Alston before, the UN Special Rapporteur. And I think when he came to the UK recently, he really demonstrated what we are up against when it comes to the current kind of governments we have. I mean, his work was not even acknowledged. It was completely rejected by the Conservative government in power in the UK. And he talked in some of the meetings he did about the unbelievable obstacles he faces, even to create a conversation within governments around the need to essentially make poverty illegal, to acknowledge economic and social rights in a legal form. So if we're looking at influencing governments directly or influencing the United Nations directly, who are themselves, deeply beholden to geopolitical machinations of governments, I think our influence would be limited, and we're just one campaign group trying to inspire people with one idea. So it all for us comes back to the need for inspiring ordinary people to become engaged with these issues. We also don't realize the power that we have if we collectively come together and mobilize on these issues. So what we do is try and inspire around this, around the Article 25, around the idea of sharing as our common cause, and hopefully, in the same way as the idea of the 99% came around when the time was ripe, hopefully the realization of the need to mobilize around Article 25 will come about in the same way. And the potential of it to be a truly international cause that unites people in all different countries may be seen. The forces opposed to that kind of a response are so formidable that the prospects are not looking good unless people really engage on a much vaster scale. I think all NGOs, charities, campaign groups suffer from the lack of engagement of ordinary people. The Occupy movement, it represented about 0.1% of the American population, and itself was focused on the US issues, not international issues specifically. From our perspective, if there was a resurgence of that spirit of peaceful, celebratory activism, then it should not just be focused on Wall Street, but it should be focused towards the UN headquarters in New York, calling for Article 25, calling for a global people's bailout, not just a bailout of ourselves and our relatively affluent lifestyles if we live in Western countries like UK, US. Many of us in the West are involved with the overconsumption and the frenetic activities and of festival going. But if we can at this time spare a thought for those who don't have anything, particularly in the very poorest countries, and think about what could be done if we were to not participate in so much needless consumption at this time, but to pool some of those resources and do something with that collective resources that we have in richer countries, not only within our own countries, but internationally. So much could be done. And I think this is a great illustration at this time of the potential power that we have if we are able to do some of the things we've been talking about in terms of engaging our heart, becoming more aware and looking at how we can make some changes and engaging politically with what's going on in the world.